Good day everyone, Trainer Maxim with you. Thank you very much for joining me for this episode. Today we're going to talk about why sometimes some piece of advice, some cues, they don't work for you, whereas for other people, they work just fine. Before we start, as always, I want to thank everyone who supports my channel. Thank you so much, guys and girls, for your comments, suggestions, for watching my videos. And of course, your generosity is greatly appreciated. Your super thanks, your donations, and my support angels. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Let's say you're learning a specific element, whether it's handstands, hollow body, rocking, or squats, or what have you. Naturally, you're trying to find a video online, on the internet, on YouTube, that would explain how to do those elements. And of course, a person who is trying to teach that element would be using a lot of cues, such as knees out, or bend at the hips, or chest in. So let's consider that cue, chest in, a very famous cue in gymnastics, especially when you try to perform any core elements, core drills, such as hollow body hold. They would be constantly telling you chest in, chest in, chest in. However, for many people, that cue, chest in, simply will not work, simply will not result in the entire core activation. But in some people, that cue would produce a very nice result with full core activation. Interestingly, how one cue works in one person and absolutely doesn't do anything in the other person. And even worse, when it does not work in the other person, the answer from the coach is typically try more, invest more time, try again, try harder, right? And on your side, you're trying to come up with a justification why that cue does not work for you, because you simply you always have proof that it works for other people. Other people are posting videos and they're saying that they're doing the chest in, and that leads to a very nice activation of the core, and they can perform great elements based on that cue, great variations of that element, from the hollow body hold into the handstands, and so on and so forth. But for you, that chest in element does not work, and you start questioning yourself. You start coming up with the justifications such as, I may be weak, I may be old, I don't have enough time, I need to put more efforts into that, and so on and so forth. And you try, and 1 year after, that cue still does not work for you. You keep pushing the rib cage in as hard as you can, but at the end of the day, nothing works better. Maybe slight improvement, but not really. So how come that one cue, the same absolute cue, works for other people and does not work for another group of people? Well, the answer is simple. Let's consider that cue, chest in. When you're a kid, you go to a gymnastic school. You enroll yourself into the gymnastics class, and you start training. You're performing hundreds of elements there. As a kid, you would be doing lots of drills for the spinal activation, lots of drills for the core activation, lots of drills for the leg activation. So it's never really one core element. It's a lot of elements you're doing at the same time. Now, at some point, they're instructing you to push the chest in to activate the core. That's all fantastic, and it worked for you. Absolutely greatly worked. And you became a gymnast, you started teaching your own class, you give that cue to other people, and it doesn't work. And as a teacher, you're baffled. How come that it worked in my case, it worked in my school, in my gymnastics school, almost for everyone, but it does not work for other people. Other people report that the neck is very heavy, the legs are heavy, they cannot move the legs when they're in the hollow body hold, and so on and so forth. So naturally, as that gymnast, you think, okay, probably they need more practice because it took me a while to get it. And that gymnast is not wrong. Of course, it takes a little bit more practice. However, the practice must be a little bit bigger, wider than just trying to get the whole body hold. Because if we have a look into that gymnast past, that we will see in that gymnast past, they will be doing a lot of spinal activity exercises, a lot of support, a lot of exercises to establish good activation of the spinal muscles, good activation of the hip muscles. And now, when in the background, in that gymnast, when he's trying to push the chest in, the spinal muscles are active, then the spinal muscles will simply hold the spinal structure as you're trying to activate the core using the cue push the chest in, but the spinal muscles will not give up its activity, and that movement will result in a nice hollow body hold, just because the spinal muscles are working nicely. But we are not typically, as gymnasts, we're not typically aware of this, because as kids you're doing a lot of drills, a lot of training is done, and you're simply following that cue. And that cue works given that other muscles are working properly in your body, such as spinal muscles, such as hip muscles, and so on and so forth. Because young gymnasts, they do a lot of physical activities, not just for the core, but for the entire body, a lot of elements, a lot of combinations. So their body works kind of organically, and when with a lot of muscles engaged at the same time, even beyond their awareness. Sometimes they are not aware that some muscles of their bodies are performing nicely. They just take it for granted because they're kids. They don't have very good body awareness yet. They don't have understanding of the human physiology. They do that element, they perform that cue, and it works because simply that cue, push the rib cage in, falls on the ground of all other spinal muscles working nicely. And when the spinal muscles supporting the spine and the core muscles trying to push the rib cage in, that it results in a very nice activation on both sides of the torso, in the front with the core, in the back with the spinal muscles. Now your torso is kind of locked between two pulling forces, one in the back, spinal muscles, and one in the front, core muscles. Now you have the whole body support, whole body position. Your body is supported, and you can perform other elements, whether you're working with the arms or legs or anything else. So now picture that situation, that gymnast starts teaching classes, handstand classes, let's say. And for the handstand classes, the whole body is a requirement, right? Other people come to that class, you come to that class, you have no prior experience in gymnastics, you have never done those hundreds of drills for the spinal muscle activation, for the hip activation, other muscle stabilizers activation, what have you. And that gymnast instructor to push the rib cage in. Now, in your case, you have never done any activities for the spinal muscles. You actually don't even know that the spinal muscles must work in harness with the core muscles. Otherwise, the full core activation is impossible without the activation of the spinal muscles, and vice versa. The spinal muscles, especially the upper spinal muscles and the mid-spinal muscles, are not going to engage even without the support from the core. So it works both ways, but we don't know about this, right? We have the cue in the head, push the rib cage in. That's what we're trying to do. We'll go on the floor and we start activating the core rib cage in. But in our case, the spinal muscles are not holding the structure of the spine. So naturally, out of all four muscles, the front core starts overpowering the movement. So your rectus abdominis is bringing the rib cage very close to the pelvis. Then that will disengage the activity of the obliques and transverse. So they will not be activated because they require some distance between the rib cage and the hips. That's why we don't like crunching in gymnastics. We like hollow body hold, where the spinal muscles are pulling the spine back, but the core muscles pulling the spine forward. And now you have neutral distance between the hips and the ribs. Neutral distance means that the obliques are kind of a little bit pre-stretched. They're in their neutral length, neutral width, and so is transverse. So naturally they can work nicely. I don't want to go deeper into the physiology of the obliques. I will make a separate video on the core mechanics. But for now, just you can see how without the spinal activation, you cannot fully engage all four core muscles, and instead you will be engaging only the front core muscles, which is very narrow, which will result only in the crunch. And with this crunch, you still have no lateral support. There is no stabilization in terms of the lateral twist or lateral crunch. No matter how hard you engage your front core, you still can move the upper back separately from the pelvis and vice versa, pelvis from the back, and so on and so forth. So that cue, push the rib cage in, will not produce any good core activation simply because the spinal muscles are not active. And it's not going to get better with even practice, with more time, no matter how much time, how many hours you put into practicing rib cage in, hollow body hold. unless you realize that it needs to be done with the spinal activity. It needs to be done with also good support from the hip muscles that are needed to be working in a certain way. Again, I don't want to go there. I will make a different video on the hip mechanics part 2. So we need the other extra muscles in the body to work properly in order to execute that cue, push the rib cage in with success. And sometimes it works in other people just because it happened to other people already to have those spinal muscles activated. For whatever reason, maybe they have better athletic background, maybe it just happened to them that the spinal muscles have been working for their entire life. No one knows. We're all shaped by our life experience, everyday activity. Maybe that guy or that girl has more active work background. Maybe they work in construction in the field. Maybe, who knows? Or maybe just because there is no one reason. But for whatever reason, when that person is trying to implement the cue rib cage in, their spinal muscles are active, and that results in a very nice hollow body hold. Versus in our body, sometimes it results in a crunch, and from that position we cannot do anything. We cannot lift the legs, we cannot lift the arms properly, shoulders are closed, we cannot do the handstands, we fall apart, and yet we've been doing the hollow body hold for the last 2-3 years. Our front core is conditioned to the point of unbelievable, but it still does not stabilize the body, because no matter what you do without awareness about that situation, you're going just always do the same algorithm of the movement. You're going to pay more attention to the core, more effort into the core, into the front core only, in the absence of the spinal muscles activation, and nothing is going to get better unless on some day you realize, oh, if I just tense the muscles, the muscles of the spine, upper middle spine, just if I try to do these, kind of trying to arch at the same time when I crunch, then it results in a much better outcome. And from that point, the moment you realize that to successfully activate the core muscles, you need the other muscles on the other side to work properly, then everything changes within minutes. Actually, you don't even need to train more. Just give it 2-3 days and it will be working just fine. So my point here is that very often, for one cue to work properly, we need to really understand what that cue is supposed to do and what preconditions must be met for that cue to work properly. Because if we take any cue out of context and try to implement that cue without understanding of the mechanics behind that cue, without understanding what's inside the watch, inside the watch we have the mechanism, and at least we need to have some general idea how that mechanism works, how those body parts interact with each other, so that we can assume we are asked with the cue rib cage in, and we know that core works in such and such way. It requires such and such support, muscle spinal activation, hip activation, and so on and so forth. So we can naturally assume that, okay, to produce that, to execute that cue in a very good way, we'd better engage the spinal muscles, the hip muscles, and so on and so forth. So now it works. Now you found a cue, you understand the mechanics of the cue, and you can use that cue to your advantage while you're trying to learn that or another skill. Otherwise, without understanding of the cue, without knowing how the inners of that cue work, we're not going to be successful. Or in fairness, in rare cases, we can be successful just by chance, just that luck was on our side, and in that specific individual, some muscles were already working properly, were already engaging properly at the time when that cue was introduced. Coincidentally, that cue was introduced on the working muscles of the spine and the hips and produced a nice result. So that's why just following the cues, let's say even for the squats, knees out, without understanding really why we need to bring knees out in the squats. And no, it's not to activate the glutes better. No, I will make a separate video on this. Not really. It's just due to mechanics of the body levers, we need the knees out. And that mechanics of the body levers must be facilitated by the correct muscle activation, glutes, inner thighs, upper mid-spine muscles, and so on and so forth. So when we understand that cue knees out, we see the picture, we see the inners working nicely together, then that element, whether it's handstands or the squats, that element becomes easy when only you understand what's going on behind the scene. If you just simply try to find the cue from gymnastic classes, chest in, or the lower back is kissing the floor, or protract the shoulders, it's not going to work. The shoulder protraction is not going to work for many who are trying to learn planches or handstands, or shoulders retraction when you're trying to squeeze the blades while you're trying to do the handstands. If you simply take it out of context, you're not going to perform a nice handstands with this cue. If you're simply trying to follow one cue, squeeze the blades. That squeeze the blades must be introduced to the background of properly working upper trapezius, properly working hollow body hold, the core spinal muscles, properly placed hips, inner thighs rotated in, and so forth and so on. So before you try to follow the cue, in order to avoid disappointments and frustrations, try to understand the logic of that cue. Ask your trainer, okay, you're giving me that cue. Could you please explain it to me from the ground zero, step by step? What happens when my brain receives that cue? What steps must be implemented at what time and what sequence? Or maybe all together. Maybe if I hear ribcage in, I should think about arching and crunching at the same time. How I should think in the first place about the movement. Not what I should do, but how I should think about that cue in order to do it correctly. Because in reality, you all well know from my other podcasts that our brain is the one who runs the show. Our brain activates your muscles. If the brain has not enough data on how to run the muscles, even with the cue, if the brain doesn't understand the essence of the cue, doesn't understand the package that is inside the cue, then the brain is not going to run the muscles successfully. And even more interestingly, the brain will try to interpret that cue in its own way based on its own experience from the past, based on its vision, based on its perception. And you might get lucky that that interpretation of the cue will coincide with the real interpretation of the cue, the way how it's meant to be working, and your brain will facilitate all those changes in your body. But it rarely happens. And if it happens, the huge role here the luck plays. So without explanation. So please, when you find a cue which you think might work for you well, first try to ask the instructor how. Explain the steps, please. Explain the logic. Explain the interaction of the body parts. Explain the general picture of that cue so that you can really understand and see the picture. And when during the exercises you are implementing that cue, you're not guessing. Your brain is not doing any guesswork to interpret what muscles, how, and etc. You know for sure what to do, and you will be successful with that cue. It's actually simple. When you understand things, anything becomes simple. So that's my message for today. Thank you very much. I hope you got some idea on the cues, why it works in some people and why it doesn't work in other people. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Thank you. Thank you. Drop a comment if you have any questions. Otherwise, go enjoy your day. Bye-bye. Trainer Maxim with you.